Are you satisfied with your understanding of sustainability? If you are not, imagine a journey together, a pluralistic one, with academia, innovators, startups, NGOs, all looking for solutions to the greatest challenge of our time. My name is Samuele Tini, and this is the Sustainability Journey. So welcome to another episode, and today we are going to see a very important area, management consulting's emerging markets. And we are doing it with an expert, and I'm very proud to welcome Emily Barran, who is the project leader of Open Capital Advisory. Thank you so much for being here, Emily.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for having me.
Emily, it's very important the role of management consulting at financial advisory to foster growth and inclusivity, especially in the emerging market. But usually we ask our guests to tell a bit about themselves and their journey, how you have become a leader in this field.
For me, that has looked like a few different things over the years. So currently, working with Open Capital, that's really focused on the impact and kind of sustainability of SMEs and the job creation and growth that we support through my work at Open Capital. And I think before that, I was really lucky to spend a year at S.1 E Business School, and S.1 E has got a very deep sort of focus on sustainability, which looks, across environmental and social kind of concerns. And so it was an amazing kind of year meeting people with really interesting and different perspectives on what sustainability looks like, and particularly kind of how to be a responsible business and sort of how to do well by doing good. And before that, I actually was in the NGO sector. So I was working, first of all, with an organization focused on criminal justice and working with people in the criminal justice system. Then more particularly spent about 3.5 years focused on education. So thinking about the early intervention with children from disadvantaged backgrounds in the UK and how to support them to a sort of safe, happy, healthy life in adulthood. So really thinking about the journey of their lives and how to intervene early enough so that they could kind of be on the right track as they entered adulthood. So I think, moved around a bit, both geographically and kind of thematically. And I think the broad themes, I guess, very personally are, I've been very fortunate. I've had a very, good education. And I think I've been excited to find ways to kind of apply that in a way that kind of, can be most useful to others. So in this case, it's kind of now, within Open Capital, we have a really fantastic kind of bank of experience, understanding of how to raise capital, how to grow a business in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, I've worked with 30, 40 plus SMEs at this point. And each time talking to a CEO about their growth strategy, talking through how they're going to raise capital, you can really feel the shift that comes over the team where they kind of are able to lock into that plan and then think about how that's going to be executed within their business. And that for me is really the best part of the job.
It's really interesting. And I think now you have just launched us, on the runway to see the problem and the work that you are doing and the importance and the crucial part, especially when you said, the team and the excitement, the SMEs. And can you explain a bit what is Open Capital? And maybe we can go also to and the history and the vision that you are trying to bring.
Open Capital, OCA, as we call it, is a management consulting and financial advisory firm. We're a team now of about 150 people. Our largest office is in Nairobi, but we have team across West Africa, office in Lagos, in Lusaka, Zambia, and also in Kampala, Uganda. But we also have team in other countries as well. And we were founded about 12 years ago by two co-founders, and one of whom's background was from investment banking, the other was from kind of big consulting company. And they started the firm with a kind of thesis that, there was capital in the market, but it was the way to kind of really accelerate growth in African economies was to help the SMEs kind of get ready to unlock that capital. and to access that capital. And we work with big range of clients across quite a wide range of sectors. We're sector agnostic. And those clients include the SMEs themselves, working directly kind of in an advisory or consulting capacity, with investors to help them source deals, to execute on those deals, and with development partners who are interested in how the private sector can kind of accelerate particular development aims, particularly, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And so we really have I think, a pretty useful perspective, both in terms of depth of experience and years of experience on the continent, a team which is the majority of whom are African nationals, but also a kind of breadth across the different parts of the ecosystem, to use the jargon. And I think that brings a lot of value to our clients.
There is capital in the market, but how we can accelerate? We read in the newspaper, this is the 21st century, it will be the African one. Which are the barriers for SME for being protagonist to this development?
And I think it's interesting, as consultants, we always want to have a problem statement. And I think, that was sort of part of your framing, which is, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think that we, to some extent, would slightly kind of push back on the idea of a problem, right? I think one of my professors in business school used to quote a sort of a saying which he absolutely loved, and I think is really relevant here, which is that the future is already here, it's unevenly distributed. And it's a sort of science fiction writer, and I feel that all the time traveling between Africa, Europe, the US, which I sort of sit at home in Nairobi where I'm based, and there are many things about life there which is much easier, already kind of much further ahead, in terms of technology process, in terms of kind of the ease of doing certain things. So, and then there are other things which obviously, are much more advanced in the UK and the US. So I think the challenges are really interesting, and they don't always show up as one sort of would expect. There are, of course, big developmental challenges, and the SDG and those people who track the SDGs can kind of speak to specifically, which areas we're most lagging behind in. But at the same time, sometimes the scarcity can in itself create big opportunities. So, to give an example, I did some work a few year or so ago about private schools in Kenya, and these are very low cost private schools, so they might cost sort of less than $100 a term to attend, so it's a very accessible form of education. And we wanted to see how these schools could access finance to help them grow further. And what we found is that the schools in the areas, this is quite anecdotally based on kind of a few examples, but schools in areas with least access to finance, so in the kind of the northeast of Kenya, which is quite a challenging region, they were actually being run not necessarily profitably, but actually on a kind of break-even basis, because there is no access to finance, and so there kind of is no choice, right? So I think very often we see, particularly in areas like farming and agriculture, some kind of, sustainable business models which aren't necessarily accelerating growth, but actually are being run on a kind of break-even or a kind of somewhat sustainable basis. So I think the challenge I think that we see often is, how do we find those opportunities for real growth and for scale? And how do we create a kind of an approach to finance that isn't just copying and pasting what happens in Silicon Valley, because that doesn't work, and there's lots of macroeconomic reasons why that's not possible, but which is able to find those business models with high growth potential, and to kind of accelerate those, and to do so in a way that has sufficient revenues behind it as well. So I think the challenge, such as it is kind of finding a fit to find what works here, rather than kind of importing ideas from outside and trying to kind of retrofit them to something that actually already works. It may just not work in the way that we expect it to work.
Targeting solution-based, and the approach that you have, also your very diverse team, as you pointed out, it's helping also you identify and really challenging, let us say, the going by the book and by the theory. And I'm sure now you have an awful lot of experience now in Nairobi supporting SMEs, 40 plus that you said before. I want to ask if you can share some impact stories, something that really touched you and shows the way we really can practically support this growth.
The stories that really stay with me, or the kind of the work that I remember most clearly, I think are those entrepreneurs who are finding ways to build and run their businesses really based on revenue, and based on kind of strength in revenue. And I think external capital, of course, has a really important role to play, but especially given the kind of broader economic environment that we're facing over the next kind of 12 to 24 months, and is really being felt already on the continent, particularly the war in Ukraine, and the impact on kind of wheat prices and other commodity prices. I think increasingly investors, particularly in East Africa, are getting more and more focused on kind of quality revenues, sort of really underpinning business models. And I think, always looking for growth, always looking for market potential, but also really wanting to understand the kind of the quality of the underlying business, and the strength of the underlying business. And so we do a lot of work in renewable energy, particularly off-grid solar, and that's really one of our kind of specialities as a business, or our kind of areas of deep expertise. And recently I was working with a business in Uganda that installs solar systems in kind of small businesses, installations for schools, for kind of small communities, etc. And they've built, a really strong business based on finding those areas of value, where there is ability and willingness to pay. They have a completely Ugandan local team, and they're able to kind of use that sort of inherent cultural understanding to make sure that they have, really clear visibility on their customers' ability and willingness to pay, which can be a real challenge in solar business in sub-Saharan Africa. But they haven't raised external capital before. And so you have this kind of fundamentally pretty strong business, but they aren't able to go to that next level of growth. They aren't able to kind of double their growth, accelerate beyond just looking for the next kind of revenue stream, the next contract. And so I think, those kind of opportunities where we're able to connect our knowledge, our background, our kind of network, relationships with investors to that kind of business who wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to see that way forward, and then to kind of bring an external perspective to their revenues. And so I think before we started working with them, they were talking about their business in terms of, well, we did this deal with this customer, and we did this deal with this customer. The strategy was there, but it wasn't described in terms of kind of a strategy in the way that one might understand it. And so we're able to bring that external perspective and kind of go, okay, well, these pieces of work fit into this part of the strategy, these pieces fit into this part of the strategy. And I think, that feels really transformative, where you can find those kind of businesses with kind of underlying quality in their work. The other one, I mentioned the work we did on education, and I think that stayed with me for a really different reason, because that was about finding the flows of finance, the flows of capital that were kind of already happening. I talked earlier about schools with less than $100 a term in fees. They might have 50 students in the school. It's a pretty small operation, and we went in thinking about understanding that market, thinking that we might be looking for some sort of flows of equity capital, and actually what we found is that the majority of the finance flows are from debt providers, from really staid traditional banks, microfinance, from savings cooperatives. And that wasn't the story we expected to find, right? We often, I think, slightly demonize banks, particularly local banks in sub-Saharan Africa, that they don't lend, they just buy treasury bills, they don't kind of, the flows of capital aren't there. And actually what we found is some of the kind of, more traditional parts of the economy, like education, which is such a staple, particularly here in Kenya, actually the money is flowing. It may not be flowing as easily as we would like, or as kind of freely, and it's not getting to all parts of the sector, but it is there. And so I think, kind of speaks to my earlier point about it doesn't always look how we expect it to, but if you can kind of work with where it is, it can make a real difference.
Very interesting cases. You see, from the practicalities, you really discover also the differences and the peculiarity of the context. And I'm sure you have hundreds of cases from your experience that are really touched. And you see also the transformational work that you are doing. The question now I really would like to ask you is, from your experiences, which are in the enterprise you have managed and then you have advised, can you give us 5 tips, the typical 5 tips that we see in the website on how to foster inclusive and sustainable investment, especially in the emerging market?
I think there are maybe 3 really big themes that have emerged over the last 4 years as long as I've been on the continent. For me, looking at them, and others might find other different ones, but are diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think within that, gender as well, and also climate change. And I think the things that are shaping what does it mean to have sustainable investment, I think that's about who's running the companies that we're investing in as a community, who do they benefit, and kind of what is the effect of their kind of business operations. And I think the diversity, equity, and inclusion theme is, and within that sort of the gender lens, and I think it is really a theme in its own right, and gender lens investing, which is becoming a very important theme. And when I speak to friends who are investors, they're feeling both an intrinsic and an external pressure really to make sure that their portfolio companies and the management of those portfolio companies is looking and reflecting kind of the communities from which the businesses come. And I think, the days where you would look at an investor's website and you look at the investment committee and you look at the leadership team and you look at the management of their portfolio companies, and there's a lot of bluntly white men on the page, I hope and I feel that they are numbered. And I think there is increasing focus and increasing, as I said, internal and external pressure to make sure that we are investing in companies run by people who are African, who are local, who are female. So I think that in terms of how do we invest sustainably, I think the really key thing is finding those entrepreneurs and taking the time to really understand the business and not just looking at the first set of financials and kind of taking that as the final, understanding. I think, speaking to the business I was working with in Uganda, we were very lucky in that instance that a development partner has supported us to work with them. We had quite a long time period to be able to really kind of get to understand the business. So I think that's probably my first tip, is have enough time at disposal, really make the effort to get into the numbers, to understand what's behind the numbers, to, ask some of the really simple but hard questions about where revenue's coming from, where are costs coming from. And I think if you're, for those listening who are thinking about starting and running those businesses, making sure that you know the answers to those questions. And it's always the simplest questions which are the hardest to answer. So I think that would be the first one. I think investors are going, increasingly to need a strategy around gender, a strategy around diversity, and a really clear route to building pipeline that reflects those priorities. And I think that is going to be a real pressure, particularly in East Africa. I think in the VC market, East Africa, particularly Kenya, has not an undeserved, but a kind of unwelcome reputation for investing a lot of money in foreign owned and founded businesses. I think it's much less acute, certainly in terms of some of the data, it's much less acute in West Africa and in Southern Africa, but in East Africa, it's quite an acute problem. And I think that will shift and that will start to change, at least I hope it will. And I think the other piece of it, and I hope starts to emerge, although I don't know that it will, is that we look for ways of deploying capital that don't try and make SMEs everything to everyone. I think sometimes, we see capital and it's looking for both a huge return and huge amounts of impact, with a pretty restrictive investment mandate where they can, only invest in X, Y, Z. And SMEs are businesses and should be treated as such. But they're also businesses working in markets with potentially quite small populations, certainly pretty small overall GDP. And so expecting, really outsized returns in a market which, for example, Kenya GDP around $80 billion. When you compare it to, the state of California with a GDP of 3.5 trillion, I think, you're just talking about a scale of magnitude that's completely different. And so I think recognizing that and understanding that and using development money in a way that is able to kind of accelerate, the blended financial approach, able to kind of de-risk other types of capital is really valuable, but making sure that doesn't come at the cost of remembering that this is fundamentally a business. And so when it comes to things like impact reporting, data collection, etc., being respectful of focusing on the core operations and understanding that growth has to be tied to core operations and the core value created by the business, and not trying to ask businesses for 25 additional things on top, which makes it very hard to kind of actually focus on your growth plan. I think, the final thing I kind of mentioned was kind of climate change. And I think this is an area that one of my colleagues who leads our agricultural practice is doing a huge amount of work on, which is the kind of emerging theme of climate smart agriculture. And I think it's going to become a really interesting area over the next 5-10 years. It's not something my work is focused on as much, but I think there are definitely opportunities there. There's definitely kind of areas to capture value. But at the same time, it is presenting some challenges and really immediate challenges. And so the kind of making sure that energy transition happens as quickly as possible, without going through some of the negative effects of how other economies have grown is going to be really key. And I think within that, we're going to have to be quite clever and I think also quite open-minded about who we work with and who our kind of partners are going to be. Because, for example, something that's not talked about very much, but in order to have the electric vehicles, which everyone's very excited about in East Africa right now, with the likes of Ampersand and other companies kind of raising capital, with that comes a huge need for minerals, and therefore for mining. And we often like to think of these two things as separate, but actually they're really going to become two sides of the same coin. If you want electric vehicles, you will need significant mineral extraction from places like DRC. So I think, we're also going to have to be quite open-minded and very clear-sighted about who we need to work with in order to kind of achieve the transition that we need to achieve. And I think often within the kind of VC impact investing world, we like to think of ourselves as kind of a bit separate from the dirty business of kind of how we get to solar panels, how we get to electric vehicles. But I think that's increasingly going to become brought much closer to home.
And it's very interesting. The last point is really interesting to see the holistic and the consequences, even not only from your own business, but the multiply and in the effect, not only between the four walls of my business, but the suppliers, and especially for critical areas like this. We will discuss the mobility in some upcoming episodes with one of the people you have mentioned. And of course, one of the things is also discussing how to go beyond the scale and the work. I think they are very interesting and incredibly useful points for people that I hope they are listening, and how to also to improve and really shape the new wave of growth and sustainable finance and investment and growth for what is the African century. We are approaching the end. As usually, we ask people to discuss from a very wonderful episode full of insights and very packed, I might say, Emily, your final call to action to the people that are listening to us.
I mean, the most important thing I've learned being an outsider, being a foreigner who has spent not very long, relatively speaking, just 4 years working on the continent, focused on the continent, and very much hope to be able to do so for the future. I think the most important thing I've learned is to not come in with preconceived ideas. And one always has them, so you can't kind of avoid having preconceived ideas. That's our experience, that's everything we've learned today. But to really keep an open mind and to really be very honest with oneself about the biases you come in with, and to look very clearly at what's happening and what's going on in the markets that you're working in, and to see what, when we think about concepts of value, when we think about concepts of growth and return, understanding what does that look like already. What was the original concept of that in the market you're working in the sector you're working in, and how does that compare to what value might look like in your mind, based on your experience and your prior work, and making sure that you're finding a way to marry the two, and not just imposing one on the other. And I think that's really the key. I'm very lucky in terms of how much I've been able to learn, and patient colleagues and clients and peers who've been there to kind of teach me. But I think if I had one thing that I would encourage people to do going forward, I think especially if you are a foreigner, if you're coming in worked and your working life hasn't been on the continent, I think that's really the key one, is to make sure that you're really listening first, and having a dialogue rather than kind of assuming that there is one way to do things.
And thank you so much, Emily, for this message. It's actually one of the pillars of this podcast, try to give a very diverse and very inclusive, from geography to sector to experience, to really avoid the preconceived ideas and try to get past and really listen to the others. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily, for this wonderful episode. And I'm sure we will see maybe in the future how to discuss more and see how your work is really unlocking sustainable growth in the emerging economy. Thank you so much, Emily. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.